Marlene, in Q&A. I'll be able to track those better. Now, Marlene's book is From Conflict to Courage: How to Stop Avoiding and Start Leading. And one of the things I see a lot in organizations is stop we try to avoid conflict as much as possible. I even saw an organization, Marlene, where the manager, this was in office work pre-pandemic, would move people to a cubicle, and everyone knew that cubicle as the cubicle you would go to when the manager didn't want to see you much anymore, so you were on your way out, so trying to avoid that conflict. But Marlene, you say conflict is not the problem. So why do we avoid conflict, and why do you say conflict is not the problem?
Well, I'll start with the second question first, why it's not the problem. So conflict is not the problem. Mismanagement is the problem. Because as long as we see conflict as a problem, we will try to avoid it. And I posted the other day on LinkedIn, you can avoid a conversation. Like there's managers that they try to avoid conversations because they don't want drama. But you can avoid a conversation or you can avoid drama, but you can't do both. So if you avoid a conversation, you're inviting drama. And one reason that conflict happens, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is the way we see conflict, the way we interpret it in our mind without really even knowing it. We see conflict as a win-lose. We get angry, we judge other people, we make up stories about why they do what they do. And when we take a step back and we say, you know what, conflict is really opposing drives, desires, and demands. If they have an opposing drive or desire or demand that I'm not aware of, now I'm curious. Now I open a conversation so I can fully understand why they're doing what they do, why they're battling me for this budget, whatever the issue is. I get curious instead of believing my story. So that's one reason that it happens, is just because of how we've been trained to view conflict. But I have another theory that I've talked about in the book. And the theory is that there's no conflict unless there's an inner conflict first. And what I mean by that is that the very reason I avoid a conversation and I feel upset and distracted is because I have an inward conflict. Like if I need to talk with someone, but I'm afraid that in talking with them, I'll lose an opportunity, I now have arrows going in separate ways because I know I want to talk with them, but my fear keeps me in protection mode. I'm going to protect myself because I don't know this outcome. I'm in the unknown. So I always say that the answer will come through the conversation, not before. So I know that's a lot to answer your question, but that's sort of the framework that I wrote the book from.
So you say, Marlene, the answer comes through the conversation, but a lot of times what I hear from people is that, I have had repeated conversations and nothing has been resolved. The conflict stays. And a lot of times the conflict seems to get worse. The so it's a little bit that, the person is not willing to have the conversation. And we tend to always think it's the other person, right? It depends on different side of it. So how can a conversation help if it has been repeated attempts at conversation where the conflict hasn't been resolved?
Yeah, it's a great question. Lots of threads I could go off on there. So one thing that with that, like I've already told them 1,000 times. I've told them 1,000 times. And I jokingly say that means you've allowed the behavior 999 times. So in other words, you think you've told them 1,000 times, but probably it was hinting, it wasn't clear, there wasn't a deadline, there wasn't a date, there wasn't an agreement. We have to learn how to be really clear in asking for what we want and getting that agreement versus I kind of hinted, I talked globally to everyone about this big problem and I hope that one guy would get what I'm saying here. And in my mind, I've told them 1,000 times, or I've said, what are you doing? And that was my second time. So we didn't really have a real conversation. We are frustrated and it feels like I've told them 1,000 times. So that's one of the issues that's going on. Another one is that sometimes we don't create accountability. For example, if it's about behavior or performance and we've had a real conversation where we had to actually plan it out, sit down, it was difficult. Then it's about saying, walk me through how you understand, what we've talked about. And we're asking them if they're willing to do something in that conversation. And in that resistance, which we can talk about more if you want to, let's say there's no resistance. Of course, I'll do that. Then as a leader, I have to set on the calendar to say, let's talk again in 2 weeks just to get an update as to how this is going. And here's what I want to see as evidence, or here's what we've agreed that the evidence will be that it's working. And so a lot of times the accountability is missing. We don't have a follow-up meeting. And here's the weird thing that happens with conflict. Once you finally, even if you don't have the skills, let's say you worked up the courage to have some sort of conversation, there's such a release of, I guess, dopamine and adrenaline. Once you've done that, it feels so good because now you don't feel like you're enemies with this person. It was hard to say, they took it on the chin, and you feel so good, you just want to sing kumbaya. But then what happens is the old behavior continues, and now you're back in that place of frustration. So the way to prevent that is to make really strong agreements and get back together. And from the purpose of, how can I support you as a leader? What are you struggling with to complete this or to follow through? What is the problem? We're looking at it from the place of support versus, I'm going to document because once I've done it 3 times, then I've got reason to fire. So our motivation has to be right, and it has to come from a very heart-centered place.
So, Marlene, I want to underline the point that you made and make 3 points on that. One, you said that clarity is really important. And I have to tell you, I get very frustrated. I had to do a talk right before the holidays where I was coming after someone else that had done a talk on feedback and had talked about the sandwich method. And I wanted to uh, get physical thinking about it. I didn't see the person that had done that because there are uh, studies and research. Actually, I led Fishback out of Chicago that shows that when you go through the sandwich method, it causes people not to understand what you are communicating. A lot of times it causes more concern. So, first of all, it's insincere. It comes across as insincere. Here's what I like about you. Here is something you need to improve. Whack. People are always waiting for that. And then here is something that you're doing positive. There is lack of clarity in communications, and I see that a lot in organizations. So I would love for you to talk about that clarity piece,
Mm.
which is really important before then touching on a couple of others.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. And so I do a lot of work around clarity. And I say that in all drama, there's always a lack of clarity. And the one with clarity navigates the ship, everyone else shovels coal. And I say that clarity can change any situation. So if you operate from the idea that clarity can change any situation, then I know that even if I don't fully understand the problem at first, if I operate from the belief that the clarity is going to resolve this, and I don't have that right now, it makes me more curious about the conversation. But the part that leaders can play in creating leadership clarity in the book, I know you've got the book, but like I'll say this for people that don't, in chapter 7, there's an actual blueprint for a conversation that, let's say the situation has gone on too long, or you inherited something and you didn't know how to deal with it because you were looking at the politics, and now you really have to have a conversation. You don't want to wing that kind of conversation. You want to do some prep work. And while that's time consuming at first, once you get it, it's like any other skill. It's really quick after you get it. But the skill that I see missing so often is leadership clarity. And that's where you have to start. And so leadership clarity, from the perspective that I teach it, is there's 3 perspectives. There's the situation, the outcome, and the obstacle. And so I use a visual of a boat, an island, and a shark. If you cannot identify accurately the situation, then you can't resolve the problem. You can't solve the problem at all because you're not in touch with reality. You're in touch with your emotions and your anger and the story that you've been telling, but you've got to learn how to accurately identify and articulate reality. So I do a lot of work around that. Then you've got to be able to say, what is the outcome? If we were getting to the island and we landed on the island, what would be the evidence that we have achieved the goal, that we're there? What does that look like, feel like, taste like? And in the middle of that, what obstacles are keeping us from getting there? So if you understand that before you even begin the conversation and you do a little bit of this prep work of what is happening that should not be happening, and I'm careful about the word should, but I use it very intentionally in this method because obviously there's a judgment about the situation. So we're going to just own that. We're going to say what is happening that should not be happening, what is not happening that should be happening. And now I have the kind of the guts of the situation. Now, if I'm talking about an individual, I can say, what is Julie doing that Julie should not be doing? And now we can talk about the individual and we get real factual about it versus all the narrative and story about them not caring, they're not engaged, they've always done this, they've never listened to me. We get rid of all of that filler and we get real clear about the situation. And so from that place, once we have leadership clarity about the situation, the outcome, and the obstacles, then we start the conversation with intention. And there's a process, which we can go into if you want to, but the intention is so clear that if I say my intention is to get you up to speed on your documentation, then that is the driving force. That is the island we're going to. So if there's a conversation that happens in the middle of that, of, well, that's not fair, you didn't get on to John, that's not part of this conversation. You can acknowledge it and say, I understand you're frustrated with that, but this, what we're talking about is your documentation. I'll deal with John. Or like, I don't think that's fair, or you ought to hear what everybody says about your leadership. That is the bait, that if someone says that, we go to the island called what everybody else thinks, and you're now allowing someone to speak for everyone else and you're distracted. So you have to be able to say, maybe you know what everyone thinks, but since they're not in the room, this is the discussion we've agreed on. And you continue very gently to press forward to the outcome that you said was the intention. So if the intention is to understand, then that's different than my intention is to coach you. If my intention is to, we have to be really careful not to go negative. My intention is to understand why you're not making sales, is different than my intention is to help you get up to speed with your sales or to help you understand the sales process. Whatever that is, we have to really work on setting intentions that drive us forward versus intentions that spiral the conversation downward.
So that clarity on the intentions and on the communication is really important and something that I also see lacking a lot of times. We think we are clear, but we are not. The clarity is based on whether the message has been clearly communicated so the other person sees the same image as we do, not what we have in our minds. So that clarity, you mentioned a couple of other things I wanted to make sure I uh, bring up before then going deeper is this needs to happen with an accountability built into it. And one of the reasons that I see, Marlene, that lacking in many organizations is the lack of structured weekly conversations. So I've a lot of times people say, well, I don't have time for it. So what ends up happening is, first of all, it's not regular conversations, and the coaching conversations happen in isolation, which it changes the emotions around it. Would love for you to talk about those aspects too, specifically with respect to the accountability and the meetings or the structure that goes in post that clarity.
Yeah, the structure part of it is the conversation, like what I just mentioned. This is the flaw. I'm sure you see this too, if I heard you right. We have the 1 year review. Like that's not effective because you're going to judge the performance based on how you feel that week of that conversation. So like if someone's going through a hard time, they could have been a horrible performer all year long, but now you feel sorry. So now it's all about, well, let's give them a 2.5 because that's adequate. And I see that in a lot of government agencies. It's on a scale of 1 to 5. We're going to give everybody no lower than a 2 point. Nobody gets more than a 3 because we don't have budgets for raises, and that'll make us seem like we're not congruent. So everybody's going to get either a 2.5 or a 3, and that's going to happen once a year. And everybody's going to grumble for a month about not getting a raise, but everybody's still going to be on the same pay scale. but we can't afford to pay more. And so the person that's been there 40 years and they're in their 60s, we can't let them go, because now that would be a lawsuit, right? Because we've said you've had good performance now for the last 30, 40 years. So all those problems exist with that year long, it's hailed as this important thing, but the truth is it's about ongoing conversations. You don't always have to have a long, lengthy, I have to really detail this out and I don't have time for that. That's for when you've let something go on too long, or you realize the part that you've played in it as a leader, there's got to be a new sheriff in town. And now I have to, it's really serious. But once you've done that, it should be just simple skills, which is what I give in the book of, for example, hey, I just noticed last week there was a couple of sales calls missed. Walk me through what happened. It's a quick conversation in the moment to determine if there's more that needs to happen. So unless we're communicating all the time with our people and we understand what their problems are, we can't really help them and coach them. We're waiting for that 1 year where we've got this pressure to fill out this form and give people feedback that's not really that relevant because we didn't catch it in the moment. So I do believe, I just read an article today from Harvard Business Review about the importance of connection, that we see that as, well, I don't have time. And we have to shift our mind to that's essential, that's that sharpening the saw of connecting. And it doesn't mean hours and hours of conversation, but a stay interview, or a one-on-one, just occasionally setting that up as part of the structure. And yet it's very fluid, because once an employee feels heard and understood, even if they've got psychological challenges and problems from their upbringing, once they're heard and they know that there's help for that kind of thing, or that they're not alone, or that you understand you had some hard times too, once you get into that human connection, you give people that hope that they can be better, that they can do better. But if you just see people as cog in a wheel, once a year evaluation, we've all got a job to do, if you're looking at it like that, then you're really leading from just sort of a checklist mentality versus this possibility that's there when we offer more of a transformative leadership style.
Yeah, and what I see, Marlene, especially with the type of leaders that are involved in LGW, is that they have the right heart, right intentions, right mindset. A lot of times find themselves being overwhelmed or so busy that they say, I didn't have time and don't have time. And again, I would say, if you cannot on a weekly basis meet one on one with each one of your direct reports, you have too many direct reports, and those become the opportunities for these coaching conversations, for other forms of feedback also. So for me, it's inexcusable not to prioritize one-on-one conversations on a weekly basis. I want to get to Emily. She says, human connection, love the emphasis on clarity, and I see empathy as an essential there. Clarity requires asking questions about our own motives and others. For example, what's going on here at a deeper level? What's the problem challenge for me? I love this, and I'm emphasizing this, Marlene, because I know this is a big part of your work. Uh, uh, what's important about this situation issue for me? What might be important about this for the other person? What's a problem challenge for them? Empathy, going deeper to ask clarity. What's really going on?
Yeah, self-awareness and digging deep and healing yourself of your own emotional wounds. And for programming, all of us have been programmed, even the best of lives with the best of parents, with the best of conditions. We've all been, we're victims to our upbringing, no matter who we are, and we're programmed. And so there's things that trigger us. And the big part of the process here that I'm teaching is exactly what she's saying, which is, let me examine my own motives. Like, if you feel good telling someone off, you'll regret it 3 months later. So if it felt good to say your piece and you can't wait to tell someone else, and then I told them, you probably didn't have the right mindset, because when you really are doing something difficult, it almost comes from a place of reverence. Um, there's sort of a sadness even around it. Like, I really, like, I'm clear that this may hurt them, but whenever we're feeling full of ourselves, we've got a story that they've screwed us over and we're done allowing it. And now we're going to hit the jugular. I think that is the hardest thing to change as a human being is to be so aware of our dark side, like our own emotional integrity. It's like I want to say that it's okay to know that you have these feelings, because that means you're human. And to say that I never have that feeling means you probably haven't dug deep enough. So to be able to say, I take responsibility for my feeling. Like if I'm judging someone, I'm the one judging. If I'm angry, they did something, but I'm the one that's experiencing anger. If they disappointed, they did something, and the situation is they did or didn't do something, but I'm the one who's experiencing the emotion or the feeling of disappointment. So if I take responsibility for that experience, and that is hard because it's the relief comes from blame. So you have to be willing to not feel relief and to let that process for a bit and do your inner work and expand your conflict capacity. And when you do that, then you can say, okay, my dark side is I feel like I hate right now, or I'm so angry. I wish that they would lose that opportunity, or I'm jealous that I didn't get it and I should have, whatever is coming up. Then you like just know that, and you let it, you own it, and then you can let it go because you're facing reality and you're going, okay, no judgment there. That's a human emotion. And how funny it is that I'm hooked into that. And now I'm able to really represent myself by saying, well, I was disappointed, or I had some green with envy going on, but now I am happy for you. You know, to be able to do that creates such a trust in the relationship to say, I'm human, it hurt me, but I allowed it to hurt me because I dwelled on it and I processed it differently than how you were meaning it, you know, and I've grown from it. Like once you expand your ability to feel hard things and to deal with hard conversations, it is so freeing and so amazing what you can be in the presence of. You don't really have to protect yourself that much anymore.
So, Marlene, I want to understand better how would we do that? I think a lot of leaders, uh, their self perception is, and I don't want to speak for the folks in LGW who are seeing and hearing this, but I'll speak for myself. I tend to agree with you, and I tend to think, well, yes, people need to do this more, but I feel I've got it mastered. So, how can we work on our own self awareness? You talk a lot and write a lot in your book about that inner game and the importance of those narratives in our own minds. How can we, rather than listening to you, watching you in LGW, and saying, yes, I know people that need to do this, how can we do it ourselves?
Well, that's a great question because I don't always need to do that. Because I tell this saying, like, when am I at at my best? I'm at my best when everything is going my way. And I will fool myself into thinking I'm done with my inner work. I've got these answers. I've written a book. Listen to me. Let me help you. And then I'll step in a hole and it'll feel pretty bad, and I'll doubt myself. And why did I write a book? I certainly don't know anything about this. So like, be okay in the sweet spot. If right now you don't need to do that, there's no reason to dredge up the past and feel bad and to look deeper and to go into the past. No reason. The reason comes when you're suffering. And that's your opportunity, is when you're hurting emotionally, you're in pain, you're in regret, you're in sorrow, you're in shame, you're in guilt, whatever those emotions that are more of a negative force. Like, emotions are just emotions, and then the thoughts that go with it, that's a feeling. So whatever's going on, if you can notice that you're on a downward spiral, avoid the opportunity to blame someone, or else have a good friend to say, I just need to be right for 5 minutes and I need to blame, and I need you to go, God, you're so right, they are crazy. Then after you've done that, like, then do your inner work and to say, this is my opportunity to expand. So apparently I still have work to do. And so, you know, when I took narrative coaching class, this was so useful to me, so useful. And sometimes I haven't liked it, but I remember it in those times. Your story is the source of your suffering. In other words, it's not what's happening. It's not what someone did. It's about your interpretation and your narrative and your repeating of what happened in your frame. So it's not about putting on a happy face. It's not about, well, I love it that it's raining on my day at the beach. It's not about that. It's about making peace with reality and accepting that, even accepting that you didn't like it, or that you got upset, and accepting your reaction or your trigger and go, wow, that showed me a side of myself, and accept that. Once you accept it, then you can expand. So my short answer is to look for where you're experiencing emotional or spiritual pain, because from that place, that's when you do this inner work. When you're good and you're feeling happy and you're in the flow, love that too, because I'm there a lot, and a lot more than I used to be. But I don't want to fool myself into thinking that I've already arrived and that there's not going to be another level of growth, because I think those opportunities always come when you're ready for the next level. And it's sort of like tectonic plates are shifting and you cannot conceive of how to control it. So in that point, you're like, here's the opportunity. It's inner work time.
And Marlene, I love that, and I've quoted you so many times. Your story is the source of your suffering, and that we can spend hours just talking about that and the impact of that. It is beautiful because whether it is in relationships or in situations, we are telling ourselves stories, and those stories end up staying in our minds, playing over and over, causing us to feel physically different, e- emotional. So, and a lot of times it's the stories. And over the holidays, we were watching a movie with my girls, actually, Avatar, and there's a part in the movie where they were emotional, and I get very emotional easily, Marlene, and I was crying. Now I know it's a story, it's a movie set, if they're actors, but the story changed my emotions and my physicality. So if you and I had talked 5 minutes later, I would have been a very different Mahan than this morning.
But I want to ask this though, were you really suffering, or were you just in empathy? Like, was it suffering, or was it just, I have empathy. I'm not suffering. I just feel what you feel and I relate, and I don't call that suffering. I think
Yes.
suffering is when you're blaming and when you think it's something that you can't control and when you feel like a victim with no choice. This is going to be helpful too to anyone that leads other people. And it's helpful to me still. One thing that goes with that is that you cannot coach an unregulated person. So a person that comes to you that's suffering and they're blaming and it's someone else's fault and they haven't accepted reality yet and they see no choice. Your only job at that point is presence to get someone to be self-regulate, to be regulated. You cannot coach an unregulated person. That is why in marriages, from a very simple standpoint, let's say the wife loses her keys and she's distraught. She's like, I lost my keys and then I was late. And the husband said, how many times have I told you to put your keys in your purse? Oh my goodness, going to be a fight because she's not self-regulated. Same thing with a man. He does something, he messes up, it costs money. And the wife says, well, how many times have I told you that that is not your greatest skill? Well, now we've received judgment. We don't see it as coaching. We're not being in partnership because we're trying to tell someone what to do when they're already unregulated and feel bad about themselves. So we have to learn how to do radical listening, and that does take time. And we also have to learn to set boundaries when we don't have the time for that listening, and to say, I am interested, but right now I'm getting ready for a meeting and I want to give this full attention. Are you good with me coming back at 2 o'clock? And so understanding that the story is the source of the suffering. Narrative coaching is about bearing witness to the story and not discounting it, but to understand that the story, when it shifts, it will change the perception. You'll shift in from chaos into possibility. You'll shift into ownership versus victim. So we just have to understand that part of human nature, which affects every single one of us, no matter how educated we are. That's how the brain works. So the story is the source of our suffering, and you cannot coach an unregulated person. And a new behavior requires a new story.
And I really appreciate that emphasis of including the fact that you can't coach an unregulated person. In that, while we're talking about the necessity for this, which is lacking in a lot of organizations and leadership conversations, there are people that the source of their suffering and the stories that are they're telling themselves are not for the manager of the team to address, they have other work that they need to do to be able to overcome that. So this doesn't solve all types of conflict in the workplace.
Mm-mm. No, because there's always inner conflict with every conflict. And so you can't rescue someone from their inner conflict. But what you can do, I always look at my coaching when I'm working with someone as a coaching slash consulting, and I've got something where I work for just 1 month. Because if someone's suffering, even on an executive level, let's say colleagues are backstabbing or they're going to the CEO, kind of like manipulating and that's not being seen, or their own employees are not following their lead and they feel like they're going to lose their position or their reputation or be moved to another department, as a way to solve it. So what I know is that I cannot know everything about every kind of business or every kind of organization or every kind of structure or every kind of politics, but what I can do is help someone get crystal clear on the role that they play, the choices they have, the situation, the outcome, and the obstacle. And once we get that, we know what relationships need conversations for healing, for clarification, for navigating in a different way. And rebuilding trust is really difficult, but it can be done. You cannot do it from a place of avoidance, though.
Now, Marlene, the other thing that I see, so there are ways of addressing conflict in teams and organizations. On the other end of the spectrum, the absolute best teams that I see have a very high level of what I would call healthy conflict, intellectual conflict. So the there are some really weak teams where there is a lot of unhealthy conflict, but there are other weak teams and or conversations where everyone is very differential, everyone's very respectful. There isn't conflict. If anything, Doug knows this. As I was chairing the LGW board, I would always tell people I wanted more conflict, more intellectual tension. So how can you go rather than people being all differential, being very like respectful, not saying anything? How can you go to embracing healthy conflict?
Gosh, we can talk about this. I love this question. And I almost want to like say, give me 30 minutes to go like meditate on this because it's so good. Um, so the situation where people are all Stepford wives, we're getting along, we agree, there's no conflict, is really from fear. It's from lack of engagement, it's from fear, and it's from the belief about conflict being bad versus conflict is just opposing drives, desires, and demands. Let's get those on the table. This is fun to dig into that and to see why you think this way. I might change my mind. So you kind of have to come from a learning mindset, not a, I need to be right and you need to be convinced. Because if you do that, that's not conflict. That's just authoritarian, top down. And we've learned that that's what it's going to be. So we're just going to get along, smile, say yes, and go do our checklist. So what you're talking about is what I would call conflict capacity. And it also comes from the learning mindset of this is going to be juicy. Instead of like me holding on to my position, I've got to be willing to be in the unknown. That is the courageous part that you have to play, is to say, although I feel an attachment to this, what if something even better comes about, or I see the loophole or the pitfall because I was willing to listen to these other points of view. Like once you kind of get into that mode, it becomes a little bit more fun. It becomes intellectually stimulating because there's curiosity and it's safe. We're not going to call each other names because we disagree. And if we see that it's getting heated, we have rules in play about how we take a breath and we laugh at ourselves and we come back. So I call that conflict capacity, with 3 parts to that. And one is culture. And that's what you're talking about. One part is culture. If the culture is such to where we just all need to look good, we need to get along, we need to know that it's all about the happy story and not ever about the bad story. We can't face reality on that end. We just continue to soft soap that. Well, that's cultural. And there's nothing you can do until that starts to intentionally be shifted. The other 2 parts of conflict capacity is the skills, which is where most organizations guide their people. We're going to do some skills training. We're going to buy LinkedIn learning, or we're going to have some workshops, or we're going to have book clubs. We're going to do this thing and you're going to learn these skills, and that should change things. But if the culture is what it is, it will not change much. And so the next part of it is the inner game. If I truly don't have the capacity for disagreement, no matter what the culture is, I'm not going to fit in there because I'm going to be too timid. It's about my inner game. It's about my programming. So there's those three parts. Once the culture's in place for that to happen, and we've decided it's a learning organization, and we invite healthy, conflict with that as well, when a decision's being made by the top, and we already know that, we don't lie about it. We don't go, your decision matters, tell us. No, if we've already decided we're doing a new software program, we tell the truth about that. We've had the research, we've listened to you, but we've already decided, because I think that's where a lot of that shutting down comes from, is that top leaders will wink, wink, we're going to get everybody engaged, yet we've already decided. So I think it's telling the truth in the culture about when it's a decision being driven by the top and by finances, and when it's a decision where your input matters. That's when you're telling the truth. You've got the culture, you've got the inner game, you've got the outer game. That's when it becomes really fun, like what you're talking about. It's a game we're playing, and we trust each other and we enjoy it. And even if we didn't get our way, we go out for drinks afterwards, you know?
Yeah, and and as you said, that is really hard to do, and it requires that focus on culture. So, would love to know. You already shared a couple of thoughts around it, Marlene. The teams, organizations, leaders that you have seen, what are the practices to encourage that kind of culture where people are more in that learning zone rather than either fearful of speaking up? I see fewer of those, at least in the organizations that I've interacted with. I see much more people almost being too polite, like the first time you meet someone, you're very cautious with what you say. It's almost closer to that level of politeness rather than a fear of engaging.
Well, that's interesting. I don't know for sure. So I'm just going to tell you what my opinion is, because I have not done the research on this, but from what I've observed, this is my interpretation of it. I believe when there's a real strong, depending on the size of the organization, it's different for, smaller sizes obviously is different. But when you're talking large organizations where there's a strong visionary leader, I think it happens more there, because visionary leaders get things done quickly. They've got a plan. They've hired the research people. They put people in place to support them and to be loyal to them. And if they're very opinionated and driven and they have no time for nonsense, I see that a lot more in that kind of organization. What I also see is a lot of backstabbing. It's very polite on the surface, but I also see a lot of he said, she said, and going around there. That's what I've seen in the ones I've worked in. And paradoxically, those organizations hire me to work with lower levels because they don't think it's them. So I've had to make some hard decisions, and I'm really doing that this year to say, do I want to do that anymore, whenever I already have an answer in my head that they haven't been open, or they don't see the role that they're playing. And so there's a place for the visionary, strong, top down. I believe there's a place for all kinds of leadership. So I'm not here to judge that. But if you want a culture where people can go to each other, there's got to be some leadership in that arena from that top leader. And if they don't have the tolerance for it, you're just going to get yes, ma'am, yes, sir. And that's how it's going to be.
So to that point, you also mentioned in your book the importance of leadership identity. What role does that play?
Yeah, what that really means, and I see this in the more the middle level, or people that are promoted to, let's say they're a great performer, they've been there every day, and they get promoted because of seniority or because of performance, but there's no investment in their knowing how to have difficult conversations, knowing how to relay what the top level, knowing how to help execute what the direction is of the top, knowing how to communicate upward, downward, across. They don't have those skills. They only know tasks. They only know the job. They have expertise in the job. What happens there is they don't yet have an identity of leader. They don't know that sometimes the people that they worked with before, they're going to have to upset them, because now they have a different alliance. It's stronger toward driving change, or whatever the top level of leaders, the strategic, initiatives. So they don't really think of themselves as a leader, and they think of themselves as either a best friend or a hero, or they have this idea. I've seen this so often. Well, you know what? I've always gotten along. I really hate conflict. And because I'm so good to these people and they've been my friends, there's not really going to be any problems. What happens after 3 or 4 months is they start getting taken advantage of. Friends call in sick, knowing they'll cover for them. Um, they take liberties because they don't feel like we're friends. I mean, you know me, you know my heart. And before long, the identity of friend is stronger than the identity of I got a difficult job to do. And this is where that line gets drawn once I go from one of them to one of us to one of them. So the identity isn't yet I'm a leader. The identity is I'm your friend and I've just got this role and this title. They don't see the change they can affect through their leadership. So they don't have the skills or the mindset for it.
So, Marlene, here's what I want to sort of bring the conversation to. I would like for you to challenge us as LGW leaders on two slightly separate fronts with respect to conflict. One, the people watching this, what is one thing they can do themselves to understand their own narratives better and or that inner game. So just one challenge, because I know your book also serves as a framework. So I think reading it and the questions you ask at the end are also helpful. So what is one challenge for each individual leader? And then if there is conflict in their teams and organization, unhealthy conflict,
Mm.
what is one thing they need to keep in mind on that? So the conversation, I want two individualized action items.
Okay.
Do this because a lot of times what I find, Marlene, is we listen to these conversations and they make sense, but we don't do anything differently afterwards. So what are you, best-selling author, have spent lots of time studying this space. We didn't get into your background, which you had spent time in manufacturing, and then how you ended up studying the psychology behind it, all of those things. Work with a lot of leaders and organizations. So tell us, give us a homework assignment so we can hold ourselves accountable to become better at handling conflict ourselves and do a better job in leading our teams and in our organizations with conflict.
Okay. So wow, that's a lot. So this is the first thing. You can do this right now at your desk. What is the elephant in the room? What is the ongoing issue? Like that's the first question you're going to ask yourself. What is the ongoing issue that has been addressed or not been addressed but is driving me crazy? Like just what is it? Like just being able to own that is the first thing, because you can't change what you don't acknowledge. So that's the first thing. I don't know if this is in the book or not, but it's an exercise that you can do. So this issue is there. So what would I have to believe about myself in order for this to continue to go on? What would I have to believe about them? And what would I have to believe about myself? This is going to question your own identity. And if you find yourself saying, yeah, but I already know what they're going to say. Yes, but I know I won't be supported from above. Yes, but I've tried that before and they really politically, they almost ruined me. What would I have to believe about this person or about myself in order to not have this conversation? So that's just self-awareness, because when you change the narrative of who you are, or even the narrative of I already know what they're going to say, my question back to you is, okay, so are you willing to say it anyway? Because that's showing me resistance. So I'm looking at your resistance to having the conversation has to do with the assumptions you're already making. So, I just read a book and it said, in the field of possibilities, we actually can change other people. And I think that is true. The saying is we can't change other people, but in the field of possibilities, we can, because when I change, there's a dynamic there. So if I'm going to operate from the same script and from the same because of a belief I have about you, you're not going to hear me, you're going to yell, you're going to scream. So if I say, well, who would I have to be to be afraid of the yelling and screaming. Well, I'd have to be someone who thinks I'm weak and I can't do that. So, like, if it's okay that you yell and scream, if it's okay that you cry, if it's okay that you pout, I can still have the conversation and I own what is mine to own. So, it's the first question is what's the elephant? What is the thing that has not been resolved? And what would I have to believe about myself to keep experiencing that? Was that helpful?
I would triple heart that, Marlene, because one of the things I mentioned earlier also is that our self awareness plays a big role in this, and this is something that can help us with our own self awareness.
Yeah, so much of it is about overcoming our own resistance. And I talk about, 3 levels of resistance. There's, I can notice your resistance. You're negative, you're this, you're going to say that. I can notice my own. Oh, I avoid, I know that, or I don't like these kind of things. So I wait till the last minute to do taxes and I avoid, or I can say, well, I am resisting your resistance. And I don't even know that it's me. I'm thinking because you're going to raise your voice. I'm thinking because you're going to say, I don't want to do that. I'm thinking because you're going to say, we've already tried that, that I can't even bring it up because I don't want to hear that. But if I'm willing to hear that anyway, we can really now engage in a conversation where I've got the capacity to hear all the reasons why it won't work. And I don't have to get mad about it. I can just go, that's what they're going to do. But that's okay. I'm still going to say what I need to say. Right. So releasing resistance is a major chapter in the book of working with high conflict people. The second question was what about teams?
With respect to minimizing negative conflict in the team environment.
It's about observation. So what's happening that shouldn't be happening? So if you notice that it's one person or a team dynamic, to be able to bring that elephant into the room. And an example that comes to mind for me is, and this happens between high level people as well as your employees. I was on a team, really a team, kind of a, wasn't a networking group, it was a personal professional development group. We were all consultants and it was negative. And I noticed it, but I never said anything. I just, my stomach would grind. There was 2 people in particular that would really go after each other. And both of them were pretty snide in their interactions with other people, even quietly. And I didn't bring it up. And I talk about this in my book, that if I would have had leadership clarity, I could have said, I've had an observation. We're supposed to be here to support each other, and we all see ourselves as leaders, yet this is what I'm experiencing, and this is what I've noticed. So I wanted to bring that into the conversation of how can we course correct, or does anybody else agree? I can only represent myself. I can't say 3 other people think this too. I just say, I feel not only excluded, but nervous about bringing my full self to the table because it seems harsh to me. And then when you open it up, almost other people will probably say, I've agreed. Well, that didn't happen. But what did happen was we were having drinks one night, and one person that was kind of one of the problem people had to stay at a different hotel. And so then the rest of us, which was so common, right? Like everything had to be specific for that person. But there was 2 or 3 that, and I got into it too. So we were sitting there, and one of the people said, don't you think it's this person? I said out loud, I said, I think there's a rudeness to our group, and I don't know where that's coming from. And one of the guys said, oh, I believe so. Don't you think it's due to this person? I said, no, I actually think it's every one of us. And I said, because while I have noticed that, I haven't said anything. I'm saying it now, and she's not here. And I said, you actually made fun of me when we were on the subway about my Southern voice, my accent, and you kept saying, where are you from, Arkansas? And there was sort of this discounting that I wasn't sure if it was a joke, and I didn't have the awareness to say, okay, you've done that 3 times. Is it supposed to be funny? Because now it's getting to where I'm feeling picked on. And so we come from this victim stance of everybody else notices that we talk about it behind doors, but we don't bring the observation into the room. So learning how to bring the observed behavior or your experience into the room for conversation, you do take a risk. You risk people going, well, you're just too sensitive. Well, that's not true. And you're going to go, perhaps I am, but this is what I need from this team. Perhaps I am. Perhaps I'm being a little bit picky, but this is what I need to see evidence of in this team to know that we're on track. You don't justify why you need it. You just ask for what you need, and you bring up the elephant that is clearly in the room that other people notice. Most of the time, other people will agree if it's a team issue, but we really want to guide the conversation to the island. Who are we as a team? Who are we in relationship to conflict? Who are we in relationship to what just happened? Because if we're going to sit around looking at the past and looking for evidence of whose fault it was, that's who we are. But if we're going to say, as a team, we learned from it, and here's what we would do next, that's a future oriented learning team. So who are we being? Is it in alignment with our values or not? That's how you start to do that inner work.
What a beautiful way to put it, and I love that example. Thank you for sharing it, Marlene, because it fits well with the title of your book, From Conflict to Courage. That takes courage. So absolutely, the two things that you mentioned is that inner work. I really appreciate that, and as I see the LGW folks and give them big hugs, we'll ask them how that went, and as well as the courage to elevate the conversation in the team when there is conflict. Really appreciate you, Marlene Chisholm. This is just the tip of the conversation. I absolutely loved your book, Conflict to Courage. I think I mentioned it at the beginning of the session that your episode, Marlene's episode, is one of the top global downloads of partnering leadership from 2022 because whether it's in our personal lives or professional lives, in our organizations, in our volunteer work, there is conflict. There is a lot of times negative conflict, and we play a role in it, both in our own narratives and whether we choose to surface it or not. And there is a level of healthy conflict we can have. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Marlene. Thank you, everyone else, for joining. Look forward to seeing you both in person and the next LGW Leadership Today session. When you get a chance, Rebecca put a link in there, Survey Monkey. Let us know and connect with Marlene on LinkedIn. Get her book. It's outstanding. Conflict to Courage. She has a lot of exercises in there too. Great seeing everyone. Big virtual hugs to you, Marlene, and look forward to seeing you soon.
I'll see you soon.
See
Bye.
you.